And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. Our show today comes to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Tsimshian people. In 2019, the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia unanimously adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People Act, becoming the first jurisdiction in Canada to enshrine UNDRIP into law. On today's Open Connection, MLA Ross gives us an update on Bill 41.
UNDRIP is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and in BC, it's more known as the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. We debated this in the legislature, and I came across this long before I went to the legislature. I was Chief Counsellor of Haida Nation Council, and when I got a hold of it and I started to read it, nobody was really talking about fully implementing it in Canada. There was a lot of lawyers that had different opinions, there was a lot of First Nation leaders that had different opinions, but my problem with it is that it never really acknowledged Section 35 of the Constitution, which recognizes Aboriginal rights and title. Section 35 was so general, because recognition just means recognition. It doesn't mean, anything legal. It just says in the Constitution the government's got to recognize rights and title. So for 40 years, First Nations were taking government to court, and every time the First Nation won a court case or lost a court case, that decision defined Section 35 of the Constitution. The most significant court case that really brought success to a band like mine, the Haida Nation Council, was the Haida Court case in 2004. But our chief counselor at the time said, we've got to start making Aboriginal rights and title a part of our future. It's the key to our future. And we all agreed. And I'm the only dumb one in the council saying, okay, what's rights and title? Because I didn't know. And so when he explained what it was, I realized, okay, I got to start doing some reading then. And back then it was hard because we didn't have Google, we didn't have cell phones. And my band at that time was so poor, we only had one computer in our office, and it belonged to the chief counselor. So you'd have to wait until he was done, and he logged off, and then you get a turn, go log on, and do your Hotmail and Uniserve. But I started downloading case law agreements, and then when our chief counsel came to us and said, we've got to intervene on the Haida Court case. So the Haida Court case of 2004 actually has some Haida content. And so over the years I started to read Delgamu, Gladstone, I started to read Mikisew Cree. I even read a lot of court cases where First Nations lost, and that became a principle of how government has to deal with Aboriginal rights and title. And what I'm trying to explain to people is that it took years and millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, to get these case law principles in place where government has no choice but to address Aboriginal rights and title honorably. And then along comes UNDRIP. And UNDRIP is such a vague document, especially when you consider 40 years of progress here in Canada in addressing Aboriginal issues. And so when I came across it as chief counsel, I just said, you know what, this is 40 years too late. This is better suited to maybe an indigenous tribe living in South America, where they're living in a jungle and they're logging out the jungle. I mean, it's more suited to them. And it makes me question whether or not some of these governments in South America, for example, or in Europe or Russia, even acknowledge Aboriginal people's rights in the same way that Canada does. Now, I'm not saying Canada's perfect, But we've come a long way. We've done a lot of work in terms of relationship building with the government and industry. But it all started with Section 35 and all of these countless court cases. So when I was creating law, I thought, why should we throw away these decades of good work, given the success it's brought to bans from Prince George to Kitimat, for example, for forestry or for LNG? Why should we throw it away on a broad general document when we've actually implemented such a good roadmap to success and getting away from the Indian Act?
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. Free, prior, and informed consent is one of the most discussed standards in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Yet, little of this discussion is about how to practically and tangibly implement it on the grounds in relations between Indigenous peoples and the Crown. Let us return to the conversation with MLA Ross.
There is such a thing as free and informed consent, and we didn't need UNDRIP to do it. We were already practicing that starting in 2004. We're already doing it. But it's not the way that people think. It's people think that free and informed consent means the government's got to get the consent, and if they don't get it, the government can't do what they intend to do in the first place. That's what they think it means. In the real working model, what we did, say for LNG, for example, when Shell came to town, who became LNG Canada, LNG Canada came to us and said, look, we're not going to make the same mistakes everybody else made. We're not going to overrun your rights and title and your interests. We're going to talk to you first. We've made our application to the Environmental Assessment Office, but we haven't completed it. We want to complete, that application with you before we move forward. And so we sat down, we negotiated for months and years, and by the time we finished out an agreement, we said, okay, let's sign this agreement, us and LNG Canada. And then we went to the government and said, look, basically, we consent to this project. Now, government, you've got to start your consultation and accommodation process because you're the one that's actually responsible for dealing with rights of title. But in terms of what industry's job was, they did it. Now we've got to look at the government's actions towards our rights and title. And so it was already there in terms of companies wanting to get the support and the consent of First Nations before they tried to get approval from the government. And even then, like when we're debating UNDRIP in the legislature, I couldn't help but notice that they were talking about free and informed consent, but they'd also say, this is not a veto. So what is it? So now I know why people are confused. So if you don't get free and informed consent, the government can still do what they intend to do in the first place. And then the government say, no, but you don't get a veto. It's, which is it? And so I can understand why people didn't understand the definition of free and informed consent versus a veto. And then we haven't really seen any of that action come out yet in terms of some of the issues facing Aboriginals in government today. Declarations are not legal. They're not legally binding. It's just like Section 35 of the Constitution. Yeah, great, you recognized it, but it's not defined, so it's not legally binding. So the same thing with UNDRIP. A lot of the clauses in UNDRIP are so vague and general, they're not specific. They're not backed up by regulations. They're not backed up by policies. They're not backed up by anything. They're not backed up by the law. So I can declare stuff. It really doesn't matter. I declare that all pens now should be yellow from now on. I'm great. Doesn't mean anything, but I declared it. It's like saying I recognize rights and title. Yeah, that's a good move, but it doesn't mean anything. You got to define it. So I think now as First Nations are starting to understand that UNDRIP doesn't mean anything, and they were basically led to believe that, that there'd be a different world in terms of jurisdictions. More and more are starting to seize the idea that, okay, I'm going to take away the responsibility of regulations and licensing away from the provincial government and take it away from the federal government. I'm going to do it myself. The latest one was on the west coast of Vancouver Island. A lot of the First Nations there that promote fish farming, they just sent out a declaration there a couple months ago and saying, look, we're fed up with the federal government not respecting us, so therefore we're going to take over all the licensing in our territory. I mean, it's gotten to that point. But there's so many different factors that go into this. And to be honest, I understood the authority of government when I was chief councillor. And when I was starting to leverage the Hydro court case, for example, now I was starting to leverage the Chilcotin court case, I had quite a few wins. I had the government agreeing to what I was trying to achieve. But I also had quite a few losses. Because government has got a different responsibility. And so when I took these losses, and they explained to me why they couldn't agree with me on a certain point, I'd say, okay, I understand that. I'll accept my loss. You win some and you lose some, but we still have our eye on the goal, right? We're trying to make this province stronger. We're trying to lift people out of poverty. We're trying to bring revenues to the government. We still have those goals, so I don't mind taking these losses. And so, but I think First Nations now are starting to realize that we're actually going backwards now. When you thought that UNDRIP was going to bring you something else, it was going to level your presence in your territory. It was going to raise that level. Now they're finding out it doesn't. It doesn't do anything. Now we're starting to see angry First Nations demanding. And the only thing I say is, look, guys, I would bring it back to Aboriginal rights and title case law in Section 35. And once you establish that foundation, then you can start talking about UNDRIP. And all the new legislation going through the legislature, they actually didn't consult as per the definition of consultation. They consulted by going to groups like the Leadership Council, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, or the BC Assembly of First Nations. And these groups are only advocates. They don't represent communities, and they don't represent rights and title. So BC government, you're breaching consultation rules as laid out by the courts.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982 recognizes and affirms existing Aboriginal rights, but does not define them. What Aboriginal rights include has been a topic of much discussion and debate, and they have been defined over time through the Supreme Court cases such as R.V. Calder and R.V. Sparrow. Let us return to the discussion with MLA Ross.
And the Indigenous governing body means an entity that is authorized to act on behalf of Indigenous peoples and hold rights recognized and affirmed by Section 35 of the Constitution Act. Indigenous people definition has the same meaning as Aboriginal people in Section 35 of the Constitution Act. And there's a really important clause here. It's got to do with the statutory power of decision. And it's in that clause is in the Judicial Review Procedure Act. And this is a clause that every First Nation leader should know. In terms of UNDRIP, for certainty, nothing in this Act, nor anything done under this Act, abrogates or derogates from the rights recognized and affirmed by Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. Now, if you're going to say something like that, you have to acknowledge all the court cases like Haida, Chilcotin, Gladstone, Mikisew Cree. You have to acknowledge that. That's a substance of Section 35. So take, for instance, the latest forestry plans the BC government announced. They said that they're going to actually cut back more logging, old growth logging, but they're going to do it in partnership with First Nations. which is fine if First Nations want that. Because First Nations do a lot of logging. They do a lot. So if they want to cut back on their own logging, fine, great. What's the government going to pay them to cut back on their own logging? But what is fundamentally wrong with this is that the government said they're going to choose 50 First Nations to actually decide this on the rules. Now that is a breach of Section 35 of the Constitution, because there's 204 bands in BC. So you're telling me you're going to take 25% of First Nations of BC and let them decide the fate of Aboriginal rights and title for First Nations for 175 First Nations? Meaning Haisla could not be at the table if they're not part of that golden 50? Maybe Kitslas is not there, or maybe a Soyuz band? I mean, 75% of the bands in BC will not be there to address their rights and title. This is crazy. If anything, and I talked to the governor about this, what do you think about Haida? The court case, what do you think about that? And I get very vague answers. It makes me think that either government is very ignorant about Aboriginal rights and title case law, or they are intentionally ignoring it. I don't see any other reason why they would do something like this. And the problem with it is they can use this broad general document of DRIPA to justify it. And so there's other things happening as well, and I think what UNDRIP did, the worst thing it did, is it raised expectations that First Nations would somehow achieve everything they wanted in terms of independence or relationship with the government. And in fact, what I'm seeing is the opposite. Because this is an act. It's basically legislation with no substance within the BC government. The only way it can actually be addressed is if government opens it up again and adds amendments. We as the official opposition, BC Liberals, we could actually propose amendments to it. We could do it in what we call a private members bill. But private members bill, they never get called because it's up to government to choose which bills to put on the floor of the legislature. And government usually just calls its own bills. They never call the opposition's bills. So it would take a lot of work, but I think, number one, First Nations should understand exactly what UNDRIP is and compare that to Aboriginal rights and title case law. And understand that this latest forestry announcement in regards to 25% of First Nations being consulted in BC is actually a derogation or an abrogation of the rights recognized and affirmed by Section 35 of the Constitution. I still think the foundation going forward has got to be the case law. It's got to be Section 35. Because otherwise, a lot of this other stuff here gives government so much leeway to do whatever they want, because the wording is so... Not only is it vague in general, some of the things they put into this act are unachievable and unrealistic.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
The table of contents is a roadmap to each portion of a document. The table of contents will allow readers to locate specific information or revisit parts within the text. In this final segment of Open Connection, MLA Ross reads 2019's Bill 41 section, Measures to Align Laws with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act.
Why does UNDRIP include a provision that says, in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples in British Columbia, the government must take all measures necessary to ensure the laws of British Columbia are consistent with the Declaration? I mean, laws are not specific to one group of people. They're not specific to one ethnicity. Laws apply to all of us. Because it's so vague in general, it actually suits government's needs more than it suits First Nation needs. And it's not really based on reality. Jody Wilson-Raybould, the Attorney General of Canada at one time, First Nations from Vancouver Island, a lawyer, very smart, and she understood rights and title. So she becomes the Attorney General of Canada, the second most powerful position in Canada. And after they're in government, she goes to a conference, a First Nations conference, and she tells the audience, who are First Nations, that UNDRIP is unworkable in Canadian law. I still think today that was the most courageous, bold thing she could have said, because it was the truth. Aboriginal leaders should understand the basics of Section 35 of the Constitution first. Understand the basics of the Haida Court case and Chilcotin. Understand that first, because really you're talking about how the government is supposed to respond to you as a First Nation when they're talking about your territory. And it's fairly clear. And we actually held the government's feet to the fire from 2004 to 2017, and government understood that. And so, on sitting across from the table, we're talking about the rights and title that are being infringed, the government has to address. In the meantime, we're on this side of the table saying, but we also understand you have a duty to the rest of the population of BC. But let's do this honorably, so nobody loses. We seem to have forgotten all of that. And we seem to be blinded by UNDRIP, because, and I can see why. UNDRIP is, you get excited, because it's easy to understand. It doesn't deliver you anything. It's not based on law, it's not based on reality, but it gets you excited in terms of maybe it's a new era. When really, if you're breaching rights and title case law, you're actually taking a step backwards. I've even characterized this as saying, look, it took us 40 years back in time, back prior to 1982. This would have been a great document prior to 1982, when nobody understood, but we still would have had to go to court to define what it meant. And that's the problem I have with this. Nobody seems to know what this really means. I mean, the government must prepare and implement an action plan to achieve the objectives of the Declaration. Okay, where's the action plan? How come that wasn't released to the general public? And they were supposed to consult all the First Nations in BC before they developed the action plan. Okay, where's the consultation? And consultation is a defined term in case law. It's not to be taken lightly. And so that's why I keep telling everybody who wants to listen, don't let UNDRIP blind you. Don't let them exact what you say. Rights and title case law is right here. It's got strength. It's got authority. It's got definition. Don't get blinded by UNDRIP over here. Because while they're doing this, you're actually making your case law principles weaker.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind and heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.